Thank you everyone and good evening. My name's Graham White. I'm from the School of Economics here at the University of Sydney. Before I go any further, let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So welcome one and all to our special event tonight. This is a John Kay lecture on Adam Smith for the John Templeton Foundation. Just a few words of background here. This is part of a year-long celebration of the tercentenary of the birth of Adam Smith. And that celebration has been spearheaded primarily by the University of Glasgow. And it's our particular pleasure to welcome here tonight two international visitors. Tonight's speaker, Sir John Kay, and also Professor Graham Roy from the Adam Smith Business School at the University of Glasgow. This celebration of the tercentenary of Adam Smith's birth has involved both individual institutions running their own or hosting their own events on Adam Smith. For our part here at Sydney, we've had two such events so far this year, a symposium in May and a public lecture by Tony Aspromourgos in June. The other part of the tercentenary celebration, organised particularly by the University of Glasgow, is a series of lectures celebrating the life and work of Adam Smith by fellows of the John Templeton Foundation, who have been travelling to different parts of the world to give those lectures. The University of Sydney is particularly excited tonight to participate in that series by hosting this event here tonight. Just one thing before I proceed any further and introduce Professor Graham Roy. Two things, housekeeping-wise. If we could make sure our phones are off or on silent, please. The other housekeeping item is that tonight's lecture is being recorded, video and audio, and I'll remind you of this again in the Q&A to follow John's lecture. Hence, if you wish to put a question during that time, you may want to consider whether you want to tell us your affiliation or name. Of course, if you wish to be famous, those details will be useful. So I'll shortly hand over to Professor Graham Roy, who will provide a little bit more background on tonight's event and also introduce tonight's speaker. As I mentioned, Graham is Professor of Economics at the Adam Smith Business School at the University of Glasgow. He's also Dean of External Engagement and Deputy Head of the College of Social Sciences. Graham has held positions at the University of Strathclyde as a senior civil servant and as a senior economic advisor, to the Scottish Government, as well as being a member of a number of high-ranking government committees, both for the Scottish and UK government. He's a regular commentator on economic policy and the Scottish economy. As of 2023, he's also a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Please give a warm welcome to Graham.
Great. Thank you very much, Graham, and it's a great pleasure to be here in Sydney for this event and to be part of this commemorations of Adam Smith, and in particular the Universities of Glasgow and Strathclyde, University of Glasgow and Sydney have had a long-standing strategic partnership, and I'm delighted that our friends and colleagues here at Sydney have been able to play a key role in the commemorations of Adam Smith's tercentenary. And Graham mentioned the fantastic lecture that Tony gave in June, which you can still see on our Adam Smith 300 website at the University of Glasgow. And we're honoured that such distinguished scholars of Smith have been able to come and join us at various events over the year and offer their reflections. The tercentenary is involved. We've had over 60 events in 20 countries in all corners of the globe, from Chicago to Beijing, from Nairobi to the West Indies. And we looked at a whole variety of different things to do to try and bring Adam Smith alive to a modern audience. And tonight is a key part of that. It's the penultimate event in a major lecture series that we've been running with the support of the John Templeton Foundation to examine Smith's contribution and legacy. And as Graham mentioned, we've held events in Washington, in Tokyo, in Santiago, London, and then this penultimate one here in Sydney. At Glasgow, we're immensely proud of Adam Smith as a key alum of our university. Smith joined as a student of the University of Glasgow at 14 years old in 1737. Interesting, he didn't graduate. In those days, you didn't always graduate, but Smith didn't graduate. He also didn't graduate from Oxford either. So perhaps it's probably not the greatest advert for a student and their discipline to their studies. But after studying both at Glasgow and Oxford, he returned to Glasgow first as Professor of Logic and then Professor of Moral Philosophy. And his lectures, we know now from his lectures, a lot of his early thinking into his two great works, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was published while he was still at Glasgow, and then arguably his most famous book, The Wealth of Nations. A lot of the research and early thinking of that was taking place at his time at Glasgow. Now, for the tercentenary, what we wanted to do was that we wanted to not just look at Smith as a historical figure, but to try and bring him alive for today. And I think the thing that really strikes us, if you think about the questions that Smith was asking himself, so what are the causes of a wealth of nation? What is the wealth of a nation? What is the role of government in helping support a wealthy nation? How do you deal with wealth in the context of climate change, in the context of inequalities? And what's the role of business in that? In his day, he was railing against East India Company, a big corporate that had great influence. Nowadays, what does that look like in the context of big multinational and global companies? So the questions that Smith was asking himself 250, 300 years ago are still pertinent and still exceptionally relevant today. And the final thing I think that Smith was really good on, and one of the things that I think as economists we can take as a lesson from Smith, is that Smith, rather than taking a model and then thinking about how it could be applied today, looked out his window and thought about how he could explain what was happening in the world today. And I think that principle about trying to better understand the real world and drawing on a whole variety of different skills from across the disciplines and social sciences, from history, from analysis, has been the hallmark of the approach that our keynote speaker has taken throughout his career. And I'm delighted to welcome Professor Sir John Kay to give this lecture today. For many of us, we got to know John through his regular column in the Financial Times, where he used to offer some insightful but also some quite cutting and witty commentary on big economic policy questions of the day. His career spanned both academia and in business. He's the author of numerous books, from tax to how to make decisions in a radically uncertain world. He's been a fellow of St John's College at Oxford since 1970. He's a former director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies and was crucial in helping shape that institute become the hugely influential think tank it is today. And he was the first dean of Oxford's Side Business School and has held chairs both at Oxford and at the London School of Economics. He's a fellow of the British Academy and also the Royal Society of Edinburgh. He was knighted in 2021, and John has been a great supporter of the work through the tercentenary, and I'm delighted that he's able to join us in Sydney for this lecture. There will be an opportunity for Q&A that Graham will host when John's finished. But will you please join me in welcoming Sir John Kay to give tonight's lecture from the pin factory to the iPhone. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Graham, and it's an honour and a pleasure to be here with you in Sydney tonight. I have a unique qualification to address you on this subject, which is that there is only one known likeness of the great man, and this is it. It is the drawing of Adam Smith, the author of The Wealth of Nations, by John Kay of Actually, I suppose there's another reason why I should be here, which is that, as Graham has explained, Smith didn't graduate either from his alma mater, the University of Glasgow, or the University of Oxford. Smith was somewhat scathing about the University of Oxford. He said, for the most part, the professors have given up even the pretense of teaching. It's a bit of a challenge to respond to that, but I hope you might go away tonight having learned at least something or been encouraged to think further about the subject. There was John Kay of Edinburgh in the 18th century, in the time of Smith, who drew caricatures not just of Smith, but of all the other major figures of the Scottish Enlightenment of the time, the great intellectual ferment in Western Europe of the moment. There was also, of course, an industrial revolution. And I'm pleased to say that John Kay's played quite a large part in that. This is John Kay, inventor of the flying shuttle, and you will see him trying to escape weavers upset by the way in which his invention was taking their jobs, a theme which has resonance to our time today. And there was yet another John Kay in the 18th century who suffered a rather similar fate. He had to flee Luddites. In fact, he was the principal target of the Luddites because his spinning jenny had taken another raft of textile jobs. So that he was a victim of the Luddites, but he was also a victim of this man, Sir Richard Arkwright, because although John Kay was the real inventor of the flying shuttle, and the man who exploited it was Sir Richard Arkwright, who became possibly the richest man in England, and certainly one of them. Richard Arkwright looks like the caricature of a capitalist you see in communist pictures. And he has some of the attributes of that. He was certainly a thief, at least of intellectual property, if not of anything else. But he was not quite the archetypal capitalist. There was a famous exchange when the lord of whatever it was said to Sir Richard, as he had then become, "Sir Richard, I hear you started off as a barber." To which Arkwright replied, "Yes, indeed, sir. And if you had started off as a barber, I fancy you would be a barber still." But we're not here to talk about John Kay's. We're here to talk about Adam Smith. So let us go directly to Adam Smith, and where The Wealth of Nations begins, which, as you will all know, is in a pin factory. As Smith explained, one man draws out the wire, another straights it, a third cuts it, a fourth points it, a fifth grinds it at the top for receiving the head. To make the head requires further operations. To put it on is a peculiar business. To whiten the pins is another. It is even a trade in itself to put them into the paper. And the important business of making a pin is in this manner divided into about 18 distinct operations. I've seen, he said, a small manufactory of this kind where 10 men only were employed, and where some of them consequently performed 2 or 3 distinct operations, the 10 men. There are 1 or 2 problems about this account, of which possibly the largest is it's very unlikely that Smith ever went anywhere near a pin factory. Pin factories, there were no pin factories close to where Smith was. What's curious is that Smith came from Kirkcaldy, which was the centre of the nail-making trade at the time. However, and some people have suggested that pins and nails in the 18th century were very much the same thing, but they weren't very much the same thing. In fact, making nails was an artisanal task. Indeed, perhaps the most famous nail maker of the time, well, he wasn't actually a nail maker himself, but he was an employer of nail makers, was Thomas Jefferson, who operated a nailery at Monticello in Virginia, where he made nails. This is a report from the overseers of the nailery. And you can see that far from it being a matter of 10 people or 18 people, 10 people engaging in 18 operations, it was actually a business in which each individual made some nails. Making nails was an artisanal trade. Making pins, however, was not. Pins were made in Normandy, Normandy was the main European centre for pin making. And this is an illustration of pin making from Diderot's Encyclopedia of 1762. And there is not much doubt, I think, that this is where Smith got the story of the pin manufactory from. He copied it out of Diderot's Encyclopedia. Indeed, with Graham earlier this summer, I had the pleasure of going into Glasgow University Library, where we were actually able to see the ledger in which Smith recorded, having withdrawn the copy of Diderot's Encyclopedia and returned it a few days later. There might be a lesson there for some of the students in the audience, but that was what he did. But it gets slightly worse than that, because apparently Smith may have plagiarized the story of the pin factory from one of his Enlightenment contemporaries, Adam Ferguson, who had reportedly lectured about the pin factory some years earlier. Ferguson also having made reference, and explicit reference, to Diderot's Encyclopedia. In fact, Ferguson accused Smith of plagiarism in his writing about the pin factory, and the two men quarrelled over this alleged plagiarism. It's rather hard to say, to blame either of them from being plagiarized in these particular circumstances. But Smith and Ferguson fell out over it, and they were not reconciled till Smith was on his deathbed nearly 15 years later. Well, this story is all quite fun, but does it matter? Not very much. Harvard Business School, as most of you will know, is almost obsessive about the teaching method of teaching by reference to cases. And from time to time, they worry about the revelation that many of the facts in these cases turn out not to be true. Now, this makes a certain difficulty, and there are several possible responses to the discovery that the facts are not true. One is to continue teaching the case with the corrected facts, but to teach it may not illustrate the points which you wish to demonstrate in the first place. The second is to find a different point to make from the same case, which is a possibility, but requires a certain degree of imagination, which I'm sure many people do at Harvard Business School, but perhaps not not all. A third is to say, well, it doesn't matter. If the case illustrates the point, that is its teaching value, and it is not important when the case is actually true or not. And I have to confess, I've done that myself, of teaching stories without any great inquiry into whether the stories are true or not. Because in the end, what students need to know, and what Smith used the story of the pin factory to illustrate, is the importance of the division of labour in business. And it is not important whether this is an accurate representation of a pin factory. And what is certainly true is that it was not necessary, is that students of the present era have no need or interest in learning how pins were made in the 18th century or how nails were made in the 18th century. And if you want to know how pins were made in the 18th century, there is an excellent museum in Normandy where you can go in order to learn it. And if you want to learn how nails were made in the 18th century, there is an even better video on YouTube made by the museum at Monticello using actors to reconstruct what happened in Jefferson's nail factory. But this is not, while it's amusing, it is not really very interesting or informative about how modern business should proceed. There's something missing, however, from all this story about the pin factory, and it was pinned down 150 years later by the economic historian Sir John Clapham, who wrote, "'Tis a pity that Adam Smith did not go a few miles from Kirkcaldy to the Carron Works." I don't actually think Sir John Clapham had very much idea of Scottish geography, but let's put that to one side for the moment. It is a pity that Adam Smith did not go a few miles from Kirkcaldy to the Carron Works to see them turning and boring their carronades, he said, inaccurately, instead of to his silly pin factory, which was only a factory in the old sense of the word. The Carron Works, and they made carronades, actually, not cannonades, but never mind. The Carron Works at near Falkirk in Scotland was actually the largest industrial plant in Scotland at the time that Smith was writing. It was possibly the largest industrial plant in Europe, and quite possibly the largest in the world at the time. The Carron Works was an iron works. It made various iron goods, most of all from the Royal Navy. The carronade is deeply significant in history, and indeed the Carron Works is significant in history, because the carronade was certainly blamed by Napoleon for his loss of the Battle of Trafalgar. It was the power of the British artillery, he thought, that had led to his defeat, and he quite explicitly referenced the carronades, implying that French iron workers ought to get up to that kind of stand. It was also true, well, the Carron Works were actually built by some semi-aristocratic families, the Cardells and the Garberts and the Gascoignes. And they had invested their agricultural wealth in business. They'd made more money in business, and they used that money to build the costly for the time Carron Works in Stenhousemuir in Scotland. So that's the story of the origin of the Carron Works. And intriguingly in history, not only did that make the cannons which gave Nelson victory at Trafalgar, or supposedly did, but it's also the case that one of the Gascoignes went to, was induced by Catherine the Great to go to Russia, where he set up a plant in the Donbass region, which might recently have come to your attention in a rather different context. It was to exploit the iron and coal reserves of the Donbass in order to make weaponry for the purposes of imperial expansion by Russia. And indeed, Gascoigne died a Russian aristocrat in St. Petersburg. So the Carron Works has quite a large place in history, but no place in Adam Smith's world. But of course, the Carron Works was, as Clapham noted, typical of the Industrial Revolution in the way that the pin factory manifestly was not. What we have here is what I'm going to call the tripartite structure of the Industrial Revolution. Well, I think we might take a moment first to say what the lessons of the pin factory, which Smith was wanting to convey to students and his readers at the time, actually was. And there were three main lessons in that. The first was the importance of the division of labour. The second was the role of business organisation in creating combination and coordination. And it was 10 people employed in the pin factory and 18 operations, which enabled the productivity of the pin factory to be realised. And the third was the effectiveness of collective intelligence. That is, the pin factory in Diderot's diagram is not, certainly not visibly, being organized by the boss who is telling everyone what to do. People in the pin factory have their own role in the collective activity. Indeed, if Smith had really been to a pin factory, he might have made rather more of that point, because what was happening in Normandy was the exemplar of what we now call an industrial cluster. That was, there were a group of numerous pin factories in Normandy which shared, as it were, and developed the secrets of pin manufacture. They don't seem to be very exciting secrets, but secrets of pin manufacture they were. And in that sense, a place like Silicon Valley was a place like the pin factory of Normandy was the precursor to places like Silicon Valley today, in which collective intelligence is developed within a community. So these are three things that we should take from the pin factory: the division of labour, the combination and coordination, and the effectiveness of collective intelligence. And I'll argue that these things are every bit as important or more important to business today than they were in Smith's time. So if we overcome our worry about whether the facts of the pin factory are accurate, as to whether Smith really went to a pin factory or whether he was talking about nails, he does actually later in The Wealth of Nations talk about nails and gives a reasonably accurate description of nail making at the time. So it's quite likely that he had been to a Concordia nail factory, but the pin factory is another story altogether. So what I'm going to do is talk about the effectiveness of collective intelligence, or I want to emphasize the importance of that. And I want today to talk about these themes of division of labour, about combination and coordination, and about the effectiveness of collective intelligence. Now, the concept of collective intelligence, or the term collective intelligence, I owe to Joe Henry, whose book, The Secret of Our Success, published in 2016, is, to my mind, the most important contribution to economic thinking of the last decade. It's not actually, importantly, by an economist. It's a book by an evolutionary anthropologist. And what Henry does is talks about the growth of collective intelligence. It's what he calls the secret of our success. It's a terrible title for a book, actually. It deserves to be put on the shelf with all the self-help books about dare to be great and the like. But it's not a book like that at all. It's a rather intelligent book about how we got to be where we are as a species. Now, collective intelligence is something that begins with collective knowledge. Collective knowledge starts from the point that as humans, the aggregate of what we know is a great deal more and more important than what any individual knows. Collective knowledge is what we have in Wikipedia. Collective knowledge is sometimes called the wisdom of crowds. This is a rather unfortunate phrase, actually. It originates with Aristotle in what I think is the correct sense, which is that a group of people in total know more than any individual in that group do. This is sometimes confused. You may have come across the James Surowiecki book, The Wisdom of Crowds, which starts with a famous story of the statistician Francis Galton going to a country fair, and at the country fair there is a competition to guess the weight of an ox. And Galton made the striking observation that, well, a lot of people say it's the mean of the guesses of the weight of the ox. It was the median of the guesses of the weight of the ox, because it's rather hard work to compute the mean, whereas computing the median is rather easy if you have a list of what the weights of the ox are. And the median was actually rather further away from the correct answer than the mean was. But never mind, we needn't worry, as I've said, about the exact truth of all these stories. It's the point it illustrates that matters. And of course, the point which is being illustrated here is that, well, 2 points. One is that human errors aggregate tend to average out overall, which is a fair point. And the wisdom of crowds is sometimes translated into the efficient market hypothesis in extreme forms, and ideas that the aggregate of people's views about things are incorporated in market prices. And there's some truth in that. But actually the far more important point is that on any particular subject, there will be any particular complex subject, there will be people who have little bits of knowledge to contribute, which taken in aggregate amount to much more than any individual will know. The aggregate of a group will typically have more knowledge than any individual in this group actually has. And that's a lesson which is important, and one which we should apply a good deal more often. But actually, collective knowledge only becomes really valuable in economic terms when it's translated into collective intelligence. And what collective intelligence means is we have a problem-solving capability which is based on that collective intelligence. I want to take a rather intriguing but strange example to make the force of this point, which is a rather simple story, which is that running. People have humans have run for thousands of years. What's surprising is that they keep on getting better at it. Many of you will have seen the film Chariots of Fire, which epitomizes the bravery and endurance and principled stubbornness of people from Scotland like Graham and myself in triumphing in the Olympics against the odds. The Scots are actually, both the Scot and the Jew win. But the Jew wins the 100 metres, which is the real prize in all of it. Harold Abrahams wins the 100 metres in the 1926 Olympics in 10.6 seconds. Less than a century later now, the world record for the 100 metres is held by Usain Bolt in 9.58 seconds. You'll notice two things about that. One is that Bolt is faster, quite a lot faster. And the other is the improvement in chronometry as well. We now measure to 100th of a second instead of to a second. So both of these things have improved. And the 100 metres times have improved by about 10%. If you look at longer distance running, you get steadily greater and greater improvements. The first marathon, modern marathon, was held in the 1896 Olympics in Greece. The winning time was just under 3 hours in that marathon. In 3 years ago, Eli Kipchoge from Ethiopia ran a marathon, the first time to run a marathon, in less than 2 hours. That's down by an hour from the original 3 hours to under 2. And actually in the recent New York marathon, 1,500 people ran that marathon in a time which would have won them a gold medal in the 1896 Olympics. We're not just better, right? There's a progression according to distance. We're better, much better relatively at long distances than we are at short. But this is something that we've been doing for millennia. Why is it that we're still getting better at it, or are in the 21st century still getting better at it? Well, it's a combination of two things. One, it's collective knowledge that we know a lot more about sports nutrition and about sports mechanics than we did even a century ago. And all of that has gone into these kind of improvement. The other is, if you watch that film, The Chariots of Fire, you will see that all the lead contestants are white men who went to elite universities in Britain or the United States. These are not the people who win gold medals in these events anymore. In fact, for the last 30 years, all gold medals in either the all gold medals in the sprints have been won by basically Afro-Americans or Afro-Caribbeans. They're all people who are basically genetically West African, who have been brought up and educated and fed in Western countries. In fact, I was rather startled. I'm not that into sport. I was rather startled to see that the 100 meters in the last Olympics was won by an Italian. He wasn't Italian. He was born in Italy and has spent all his life in Italy. But it turns out that his father is actually an African-American serviceman who married an Italian woman while living in and while posted in Italy. On the other hand, on the other side of the continent, all the long-distance sprints are now won by people of East African background. We can talk about the issues of culture and genetics that go into that, but certainly globalization has transformed who wins these events, as it has transformed who achieves so much else in the world today. Globalization and collective knowledge and intelligence have led to these kind of improvements. And I could tell the same kind of story in other very different and more business relevant contexts. I could talk about the evolution of flight. People have had aspirations to flight, certainly for a couple of thousand years. The Greeks had the story of Icarus, who adopted what is the obvious method of flying. Birds fly and we don't. Birds have wings and we don't. So the way we need to fly is to have wings. And you'll recall that Icarus attached wings to his arms and flew, or in the myth he flew, but unfortunately he flew too close to the sun, and the wax that attached the feathers to his arms melted. That turned out not to be a very good design for flight, nor did Leonardo da Vinci's designs turn out to be very useful for flight. We started getting better at flight when we learned round about the time of Adam Smith that if you had enough forward thrust, you could actually keep in the air, at least for some time. You could even keep in the air for about a minute, which was what the Wright brothers did in 1903. But getting enough for forward thrust to keep a plane in the air all the way from London to Sydney took quite a lot more effort. But an effort that we have now managed to achieve. And we've achieved that by a whole variety of mechanisms. We understand aerodynamics better. We have fuels which are a lot easier to transport and carry around. We have informatics that enables the plane to fly effectively. We have jet engines which operate by a different kind of thrust mechanism, and so on. All this is a story of collective knowledge being translated into collective intelligence with remarkable results. And if we think of where we are today, the modern civil aviation, modern civil aircraft, is probably the most complex manufactured product we have today. Airbuses are produced in Europe. If we think about the Airbus for a moment, we realize that there is literally nobody in the world who knows how to build an Airbus. Nor is there even a manual that tells you how to build an Airbus. There is no way you could go to the university library and get out the book labelled making an Airbus and come home and make one yourself. Indeed, you will find in the library a book by Thomas Thwaites, who decided to make his own toaster, and he did it from scratch, getting together all the materials in order to put the toaster together. It took him about 6 months. It cost about $1,000 compared with a shop-bought toaster that you can get for $20, and it wasn't as good as the shop-bought toaster that you can get for $20. But at least he could do it. And it's possible to imagine an individual making a toaster. It's not possible to imagine making a civil aircraft. To repeat, 10,000 people working together know how to build an Airbus. No individual one of them does. What that requires, of course, is a degree of extraordinary coordination, the combination of coordination that makes the division of labour possible. And that's what enables us to do this kind of thing. It's the power of collective intelligence brought together by coordination. This story, although I like it very much, that George Bush told Tony Blair the trouble with the French is they don't have a word for entrepreneur, is, I'm assured on the best authority, like the person who's supposed to have heard it, that is not true. But it's interesting to reflect on, because it makes one think about the meaning of the French word entrepreneur. Today we're encouraged to believe in the American sense of the word entrepreneur, that the entrepreneur is the person who has the flash of individual genius that enables him to build aeroplanes, whereas people before him were not able to do that. That really isn't, as I've described, what collective intelligence and the economic development associated with it is like at all. It is about combination and coordination. So entrepreneur in French means essentially take things together. It's the combination which is the essence of the entrepreneurial activity. And that in Smith's Spin Factory was in large measure what he was describing. And that coordination and combination is taken in this extraordinary manufactured product, which is the Airbus. This is not actually an Airbus itself. It has Airbus painted on the fuselage because it is what Airbus calls the beluga. It is a huge plane which serves no function other than to fly around Europe picking up bits of the Airbus. There are bits of the Airbus made in places all around Europe, and the beluga helps with the transportation of these bits of the aircraft to the Airbus assembly plant in Toulouse. I gather you're on your way, Graham, to Toulouse, so you can report on the veracity of what I'm saying when you come back. But there is, it's actually the third largest building in the world after the Boeing factory in Seattle and the Grand Mosque in Mecca. So you can inspect that if you actually have time. I don't know if you've been to either of the other two yet, but they may be on your grand tour. Anyway, this Toulouse factory assembles the Airbus from bits that are brought partly using the beluga, partly by other mechanisms from all around Europe. The wings come from Broughton in Wales. The fuselage, much of the fuselage comes from Getafe in Spain, and so on. All these bits are coordinated ultimately in an Airbus, and that is what the Airbus organization does. So all of this is an exercise in coordination which enables one to deploy collective knowledge into complex products. And that is the nature of modern production and modern business. And I labelled this talk From the Pin Factory to the iPhone, because the iPhone is in many ways an ultimate example of this kind of of coordination. Let's make the point again that there is nobody in the world who knows how to make an iPhone, but a large number of people together do. Secondly, no individual could make an iPhone, but a group of people working together do. But also, the essence of the iPhone is the combination. There is nothing your smartphone does that you did not have some device that could do already. You had a phone, you had a sat-nav, you had a messaging system, you had a map, you had a music player. All these things were already there. The essential contribution of the iPhone is to put them all together in a single device, which you can put in your pocket. And the genius of the marketing of the iPhone was to open up the operating systems of it to enable independent developers to produce apps which we all place on our phones, which enable us to do a whole variety of things other than the basics which Apple intended us to do. That's the nature of this modern product. And if you look on the box when you buy your iPhone, it will say designed in California, but that is pretty much all that happens in California. Most iPhones are assembled in China by a company called Foxconn, which in turn is a subsidiary of a Taiwanese company called Haihon Industries. The design happens in California. The assembly happens in China, but the assembly accounts for about $20 of the total value of the cost of the iPhone. The components add up to quite a lot more. Interestingly, the largest supplier of components for the iPhone is Samsung, who are, of course, Apple's principal rival in the production of these products. And it's actually the components which account for most of the cost. But what you can see, I think, here is the business of what I think of as the dematerialization of products. That is, if we go back to the carronade and the pin factory, we're talking about products where the bulk of the cost of the product and the value of the product lies in the raw materials. This isn't what things are like anymore. Alan Greenspan famously said in about 2000 that the weight of American GDP was about the same as it had been 100 years ago. I haven't the slightest idea how he calculated that, and I'm pretty sure he didn't. But I suspect if he had, it might not have been too far from the truth. We just took, for amusement, a variety of products and asked what had happened to them and what in terms of the value judged by weight relative to cost. The carronade, taking it to 2020, cost about £2 a kilo. We looked up the most effective equivalent of the rifle, which was the carronade, which was the principal rifle used today by the British Army. It costs about £200 per kilo. You can see that the value rests not in the raw material, but in the intelligence that goes into construction. Henry Ford's Model T cost, we reckon, about £27 a kilo. The Airbus 380, the biggest plane in the world, costs 50 times that per kilo. Even in terms of more basic activities like construction, the Burj Khalifa, now the tallest building in the world, costs about twice as much per kilo as the Empire State Building, then the tallest building in the world. We compared the iPhone today with the first mobile phone actually to be produced. The Dynatalk cost about £5,000, and it weighed half a kilo, which is not terribly convenient to carry around. some of us are old enough to remember carrying around the first mobile phones, which were like bricks weighing down your bag. They certainly didn't fit in your pocket. We even took the pin, which was Adam Smith's iconic product, or allegedly so, and compared it with what I think is the most expensive product per kilo we could find on the market at the moment, which is the Pfizer COVID-19 vaccine, which works out about £500,000 a kilo. But as you can guess, you can get rather a lot of doses out of a kilo of the Pfizer vaccine. This is what I call the dematerialization of production. When the cost and value of what we buy today rests not in the raw materials, but in the collective intelligence which is being deployed in relation to that particular product. And if you get into an argument with people who are engaged in the so-called degrowth movement today, who worry about the way in which our resources have been used up, I suggest this table is something you take with you to discuss with them. All the physical resources we have on Earth are in finite supply. The collective intelligence which goes into manufactured products is not. So that products in this way have dematerialized, and so in a large degree has production. What happens to that Airbus when it comes out of the factory in Toulouse? Well, you may be naive enough to think that when you get on a plane, that the plane is owned by the airline whose logo is painted along the cabin. It's very unlikely that that is true. The largest owner of planes in the world is a company called AerCap, which is based in Dublin, and it employs no pilots, whatever. It does, however, employ a great many accountants and IT specialists. It's the largest owner of planes in the world, and planes are owned, in the main, by organizations like AerCap. Indeed, you can buy a plane yourself. You can buy a share in a plane. I have to confess, I own a share in an Airbus. It's not a very big share in an Airbus, and it doesn't relate to any particular bit of the Airbus, but it's possible for all of you to be part owners of an Airbus. You may think that the company that owns the plane will at least own the engines. You will be wrong. The engines on a modern civil airliner are well, the airline that flies it takes out a contract with an aero engine manufacturer, such as Rolls-Royce or General Electric or Pratt & Whitney, to buy air engine services, typically for 10 years. So Rolls-Royce agreed to provide engines for the plane for a decade, and they will maintain the engines, quite possibly replace the engines during the life of that contract. You might think, so Rolls-Royce owns the engines. Well, it doesn't actually. Rolls-Royce has typically sold the engines on to another company, most commonly in this case a company called GATX, which owns a large proportion of the world's rolling stock. In fact, if you remember the incident earlier this year in which a rail car exploded in East Palestine, and not East Palestine, the one we're thinking about now, East Palestine, the village in the United States, spewing toxic waste into the atmosphere. And that was another thing which was owned by GATX. It specializes in the ownership of things like that, aero engines, rolling stock, and so on. One can go on listing these kind of companies. That's the nature of the ownership of capital in the modern economy. When I talk about these aren't in any way special. If you drive past an Amazon warehouse with Amazon painted on the side, or you get something delivered to your front door by an Amazon truck. You may again be naive enough to think that Amazon owns the warehouse or the truck. Almost certainly it doesn't. Amazon leases the warehouse from a warehouse leasing company. The largest owner of Amazon warehouses is a San Francisco-based company called Prologis. Similarly, the vehicles may be owned and run by the person who's driving them, or they may be owned, more likely, owned by another specialist company. It goes on and on. In fact, if you think about Amazon or look at Amazon, you will discover that the main driver of profits for the Amazon company, is not the retail operation with which we're all familiar. It's Amazon Web Services, which provides cloud computing facilities to a great many large companies. Cloud computing it provides. So you think Amazon owns data service? Well, no, it doesn't. Amazon owns the means or operates the means of accessing data services. The largest owner of data centers and the largest provider to Amazon is another company called Equinix. And this goes on and on. What we have today is not capital in the sense in which it was capital for the Karen works in the 18th century. Firms today buy capital as a service, as they buy any other service, like electricity or water. And Deirdre McCloskey has expressed this in quite an effective way by saying that, of course, companies need capital, as they need water and electricity and so on. But we don't talk about waterism or electricityism. And we certainly don't think of the providers of water and electricity as being the people who control these companies. They don't. Capital we have today, what I call capital as a service, which is something that is provided by specialist providers of capital services to operating businesses, to the hollow corporations of the 21st century. Not only do we have capital as a service, we actually have labour as a service as well, for the kind of undifferentiated labour which is needed to operate modern businesses. The labour which is employed in catering, in cleaning, in facilities management, in security and so on. The dominant providers of these are specialist companies like G4S, Compass and so on. Labour in the sense, commodity labour is provided as a service to these companies. What the company itself does is the hollow entity which combines these factors into a single production process and the products which we all recognise and enjoy. A hollow corporation, as we now call it, does nothing but coordinate. And it's hard to exaggerate the magnitude of the change from the world of Henry Ford 100 years ago, who was so obsessed with the idea of controlling all aspects of production, that he even set up a plantation in Brazil to ensure that the tyres on Ford cars would only be made by Ford itself. There's an area of Brazil today which is still called Fordlandia, which because it was the site of Henry Ford's rubber plantation. But companies don't do that anymore, and they don't think it's sensible to do that anymore, and it certainly isn't necessary to do it anymore. So the hollow corporation I'm describing, like Amazon or Apple, essentially is a coordinating entity that buys in these variety of services. Glass and silicon, labour and capital and the right. And the essence of the business is that it is engaged in combination. And we have other kinds of hollow corporations as well. We have franchising. We're all very familiar with the fast food franchises. The typical McDonald's or Starbucks is not actually owned by McDonald's or Starbucks. It is franchised with the operating system, which is provided to the franchisee, who provides his own capital for investment. We have platforms. We have the social media companies. We have businesses like Google and Facebook, where the customers are also the suppliers of the product, and the company itself simply provides that coordinating function. We can go further to find companies that provide nothing but intermediary services, companies like Uber or Airbnb, which do nothing except bring buyers and sellers of products together. So what would Adam Smith have thought of all of this? Well, it's actually a silly question. Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations with a quill pen in a house that didn't have running water, where electricity had not been imagined, and where if he had wanted to go to a pin factory, he would have to either walk or get a horse and carriage to take him there. It's idle to think what he would have thought, as stupid as to ask the question, what would the founding fathers have thought about the internet? The founding fathers, for other obvious reasons, didn't think anything about the internet. We shouldn't look to Smith to find insights into the nature of this modern business, which he could not have imagined. And yet, there are two things we can take from Smith to understand modern business. The first is that the factors Smith was emphasizing in talking about the pin factory, the division of labor, coordination and combination, and collective intelligence, are just as important to modern business as they were to business of Smith's era. Indeed, they're almost more important, because there was what one might call the traditional capitalist era, in which production in the West took place in large plants with elaborate capital and essentially commodified labor. The world is not like that anymore. But the other thing we can take from Smith is that Smith thought one couldn't talk about business and economics without a much broader background in anthropology, well, subjects that weren't treated as independent disciplines there, but without thinking about psychology, anthropology, sociology, and all the other social sciences that are critical to understanding organizations. I think if Smith were alive today, he would have worried and read and thought about these things. I'm sure he would. And if we want to understand business, we need to do the same. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for not only interesting discussion about Smith, but some interesting reflections about the nature of capitalism. So we have a couple of roving mics. John has kindly agreed to answer some questions, and so we're adjourning to the lounge room. I'll just get my wine. And there's a couple of roving mics coming around. So please remember that you are being recorded. So yes, I think we have. Yes, please. Just thank you.
So, okay, thank you very much. I'm just looking at the slide you have before us. Price per kilogram. I'm just wondering, is there a less crude way of measuring, say, for example, price per utility value? Is there something that's probably a little bit more valuable for us to be able to appreciate than price per kilogram, in order to be able to compare what they did in the carronades versus the COVID-19 vaccine?
I suppose you could compare the carronade and the rifle by asking how many people you can kill in a minute with each of these. You have to, once you start thinking in these terms, you have to start asking what the nature of the output is. And that's a very interesting question. You might know there's an article that's much less seminal than I think it should have been, which is by Bill Nordhaus, which looked at the price of light over thousands of years. And what he showed was that the price of light, how much the price of light had fallen from the days thousands of years ago where the only way you could get light was to gather firewood and make a fire, whereas now you get light by turning on a switch. So that light went through firewood to flints, to candles, to simple electric lights, to incandescent lights, and to lights today. What I found was interesting was that we looked at, Nordhaus published his article in the late 90s, or it might have been 2000. We looked at what had happened to the price of light, judged by pounds or dollars per kilo, per lumen, rather, in the 20 years since Nordhaus wrote. And it's fallen by about another 3/4. That is, the bulbs we have now are so much more efficient than the bulbs we had even 20 years ago, that the price per lumen of light has fallen spectacularly. That's not actually what we measure in our retail prices index, consumer prices index. We measure the price of the things you use to make light, which is not at all the same thing. So it's an interesting question, but you have to ask the deeper question of what the human need that these products are satisfying is. And in the case of light, it's an interesting case to take because it's fairly clear what you want. It's also fairly clear that what you want is light rather than things you use to make light, just as what you want is clean laundry rather than a washing machine. That's true of every item of household expenditure production. It's true of production pretty generally, which is why I'm very suspicious about people measuring trends in productivity. So it's a good question. It's a question that suggests lots of great research projects, but it's not a question that has an easy answer.
Yeah, good day, John. And you'll be pleased to hear that Nordhaus's light thing is in every standard first-year textbook taught at university these days. So, in fact, it's getting its due dessert. And you're right, it's a fascinating insight. I want to focus a bit on your wisdom of the crowds and the way you've interpreted that as coordination as the legacy of Smith's work, which is clearly an important aspect of it. But as we know, the wisdom of the crowds definitely doesn't necessarily end up with wisdom. Much collective crowd opinion turns out to have misconceptions that are numerous, political views and other sorts of things. The issue that you're saying as to why the wisdom works and the coordination process works is because there's another coordination going on, which is competition and the desire to deliver products and services that other people want, if you like, to solve other people's problems. And the fact that you can only reward yourself by profit, by solving other people's problems was, of course, the other insight of Smith that you didn't mention, which is the sort of the so-called selfish comment that the baker following on his own thoughts is actually achieving what's the best for society as a whole. You didn't bring that aspect in to your coordination aspect. It was more around the productive side. But I can't see how that works successfully unless you actually have this very active aspect of the delivery of quality products to other people, for which the coordination aspect forces us all together, even though it's basically around self-interest.
Yep, I think that's absolutely right. And I could have spent another hour talking about competition and what I've written and talked about as disciplined pluralism, which seems to me the essential characteristic of a market economy, that there's freedom to experiment, but also a process that shuts off unsuccessful experiment and imitates the successful. In terms of the wisdom of the crowds, this is not a suggestion that we decide how to build an aircraft, or we decide how to steer the plane by asking the passengers what they think. If we're sensible about it, we try and send a pilot to be trained in how you actually operate the plane. And we all agree that that is what we should do. And the airlines that operate by training their pilots and trusting the pilot are rather more successful than the airlines that follow what the average of the passengers thinks. And that's an observation that seems obvious in that context, but is not as obvious to people in a variety of political contexts. So I agree with the rest of the question.
So, John, the growth to wealth, I appreciate acknowledging the sort of collectivisation. Where's the nation going? I mean, the nation, in some ways, is just merely a barrier to entry. I mean, does it have a role in 100 years?
I think the role of the nation, and it's a role that cuts several ways, is I take Branko Milanovic's point that the largest source of economic rent is where you are born and what citizenship you acquire. And that one is an awful lot better off being born a citizen of Switzerland than being of North Korea. And you don't have any choice about that. And Switzerland and Australia and Britain and most of the countries of the world have rather strong vested interests in maintaining the rents accruing to their current population relative to others. That's the role of the nation. It's not a very easy notion to defend, but equally the reality of the collective intelligence that exists in Australia and Britain and in Switzerland is rather different from that which exists or fails to exist in a lot of countries of the world. So it's rather understandable. It's not just understandable, but defensible, and the people who live in these countries should wish to protect it.
We still have time for some questions.
So, John, thank you very much for the talk. It was fascinating. In your book with Mervyn King, you make the distinction between what I think is resolvable uncertainty and radical uncertainty. And I was interested in the discussion and the development of corporate specialisation, if I can call it that, where, for example, Amazon outsources the management of property. Just be interested in your thoughts on whether you see that as simply the ability of a property manager to diversify those risks and therefore being more efficient at providing that, or if it's the ability of a property manager to convert what you'd call radical uncertainty into resolvable uncertainty, and that is a question of their knowledge of how to run a portfolio of properties or something.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about specialist capital providers, which we largely are today, there's the question of whether to what extent their competitive advantage rests on particular skills in managing these or providing these facilities, which is probably true in the case of Prologis or Equinix, that they have specialist skills in providing data centers or warehouse construction and leasing. So that and they're able to build a diversified portfolio. I think this is just an extension of what has been going on for several centuries, which is the divorce of financial assets from physical assets. And it's now taken a fairly extreme form in relation to the development of these capital service companies. And of course it's found its ludicrous form in the development of pseudo-assets like cryptocurrencies and non-fungible asset tokens, which have no basis in any assets at all, any physical assets at all, or frankly in any reality that I can see.
Just in terms of what we see in front of us, price per kilo of production, and it's difficult to measure that price per kilo in a service. Something when I was at university 30 odd years ago was that not all the costs of production are actually considered. So in terms of, say, producing an iPhone, things like the environmental costs or the costs on I don't know, human society or whatever. How does one reconcile that, or how does one measure that and to properly consider the costs of producing an item?
Well, you can talk about the cost of producing an iPhone in terms of the environmental consequences, which I have to say I find it difficult to see as being very large. You can talk about the costs of the human costs of the iPhone in the sense that it's now very difficult to walk down the streets of London without being bumped into by people who are not looking where they're going because they're on their iPhones. I'm not quite sure how one factors in the costs of that. I fear that the people who wish to do that are mostly people who wish to dictate how other people ought to live, and I'm suspicious of it. But I would rather not bump into people who are looking at their iPhone other than the road ahead. And I hope this will end up as a passing phase in human society.
What about people with Androids?
I'm afraid they may be just as bad.
Yeah, probably. I think we have time for one, sneak in one, just down here. Thanks, Dana.
I've been looking at the price difference between the Dynatac and the iPhone. It's been bugging me. And I had a question about, I think there's an information density in an iPhone, a complexity in the software and in the knowledge that's there that wasn't in the Dynatac. Do you think that as we rely more and more on knowledge that can just be copied for free, programs and software, it will change the model for collective intelligence and its relationship in what you've provided?
Yeah, what's rather misleading in that is that the iPhone is so much better than the Dynatac. And one just put the weights and prices there as a starting point for having that kind of conversation. Yeah, I mean, the value of the iPhone or the smartphone or the Android lies almost entirely in the software and the apps, and has nothing to do with the cost of the underlying hardware. The environmental cost in terms of are we running out of the silicon and lithium that go into making the iPhone? Well, we're a long way from doing that, and we'll make a lot of iPhones before we actually reach that point. The key point underlying all of this is to say that the value of these products rests essentially in the collective intelligence that has gone into them and is used in their application and is not in the physical product itself.
I think we have to wind it up at this particular point. Please join me in thanking to John Kay. Please join me also in thanking Graham Roy. Before we finish, I just want to say a word of thanks to a few people, just the organisers, in particular the work of those in the Faculty Strategic Partnerships and Engagement team. That's Liz Kenner, Priscilla Trevisan, I hope I got the right, Darren Swanfield, and particularly the team's events coordinator, Larissa Centorino, and also the events coordinator of the School of Economics, that's Sandra Lang. Also like to thank Nathan Moore, who's provided audio-visual support, and also Tran, excuse me, Tran Howlett for the catering tonight. And of course, I want to thank all of you for coming along and making this event. I hope you've enjoyed yourself. I hope to see you again soon, and enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.
And now you can switch your iPhones on again.